Welcome to New West Press Audio, the official podcast of New West Press. We're an independent publishing outfit located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. My name is Matt Bose. I'm the general manager of New West Press. And with me today is Danial Neil, author of the new book, The Sum of One Man's Pleasure. How are you today, Daniel?
I'm good, Matt. Thanks.
Good. So this is your second book with New West Press, coming off of Dominion of Mercy from 3 years ago. Do you want to let our listeners know what the new one's about?
The new book is about, I was interested in finding something in Canada that's unknown or not well known. And I came across, when I was doing some research through the RCMP a few years ago in a novel that I was thinking of, I came across the purge of the 50s, post-McCarthy era, and purging homosexuals from the civil service. I was intrigued by that. I didn't think it was well known or well appreciated. So I decided to write a novel about a person who was caught up in the homosexual purge, who worked for the civil service and was banished from Ottawa. And he ended up in an estate in Vancouver Island. One of his business associates that he worked with in government Ottawa um, offered him a job, offered him a way out. So that's what the book is about, is this Finn Kenny hiding from his past in this estate in Vancouver Island. That person who invited him dies suddenly, and the estate is taken over by his wife. And then begins a heated conflict about secrets. And the story goes from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I knew a little bit about it because of David Chiros's play. I forget the name of it, but it talked about the fruit machine, which was this kind of quasi lie detector test thing that they would stick to people that could apparently tell if you were gay. Well, it didn't actually do that, but they
Yeah.
basically kind of used it for blackmail. I know a bit more about like the McCarthy era red purges in the States and how, especially with gay people and like alcoholics, like the main guy in the book is, they thought that they would be like easier for the Soviets to blackmail themselves and like turn against the US. So that's why they were kind of seen as liabilities and kicked out, in addition to homophobia, etc. Um, but yeah, I didn't really know that much about the Canadian equivalent. What were some interesting facts you learned about that period in sort of federal, provincial history in Canada?
Well, they were post World War II. Of course, the Americans were very afraid of communism um, destroying their democracy, and that spilled over into Canada. And the fruit machine was originated in the States, so that spilled over into Canada. And the Cold War affecting the United States, anything that affected the States was going to affect Canada. And so the RCMP took over that role of making sure that uh, gay men primarily were ousted from civil service so that the Russian operatives wouldn't have access to secrets. So it was primarily the RCMP. Diefenbaker was the prime minister in the early 60s, in the late 50s, and he handed everything over the RCMP. They had the key role. It was that time the RCMP was actually a very powerful force, and they almost dictated how this is going to play out. And so it was pretty the interventions that they were uh, imposing on the civil service. It was pretty brutal. I mean, there was interrogations that lasted for days, and it was really harsh. So finally, Diefenbaker was not reelected, and that's when the story takes place. It's a little more calmer, even though that the Cold War was in full force in the early '60s, and I touched about a little bit about that in the book when John F. Kennedy died, and how that kind of affected the story. Because of my personal account, I remember that day when I was a kid. Our school, the principal came on the loudspeaker in the classroom, and the school was dismissed. The teachers were crying. The kids were upset. It was really strange. It struck me how, even at that time, how children knew about John F. Kennedy. I mean, we were very close to the American. Most of our television was American, except for the CBC maybe. But those were the interesting parts of the era. I like the simplicity of the era, but it had a lot of the same fears that we have today. They're just a little different. Uh, but anyway, Finn Kenny, the main protagonist of the story, he deals with he has to deal with the estate, and Catherine, she is the now she's the one that takes over the estate from her husband. So the conflict ensues.
Yeah, you always hear about people talking about when JFK died, and I don't know. I always felt like kind of an overreaction in Canada. He's not our president. And I remember like probably the most equivalent thing that happened to me when I was in school was 9/11, and I knew that things were going to be different, but I didn't particularly care that the US was getting attacked. I don't really like them, so it didn't really bother me. But it's interesting how maybe that kind of nationalism spills over in the States back then when there's less, I don't know, kind of independent media and people are more likely to believe what the government says about things, etc. Um, yeah, it's also interesting, like breaking news, right? Like this, they got this Ukrainian guy at the Parliament building, and he was a legit Nazi, and they didn't look him up. And yeah, the governments back then, you can see this in the film Oppenheimer too. They were much more worried about communists than fascists, which is crazy considering they just had a war about it. But they're like, say
Yeah,
what you will about this guy, he's definitely not a communist. Like, it's such a stark worldview, and it can be
yeah,
difficult for people nowadays to kind of get back into it. But I'm glad we've moved on. But
yeah,
obviously, some people still need to get the memo.
yeah.
Um, but the most of the book takes place on sort of a big timber estate in British Columbia. And did you do a lot of research on how those sort of things were run? Like, it almost seems like this guy, like you call her Lady Spencer throughout, like he was almost royalty for having been a timber speculator baron. Like, how did that kind of work back then?
Well, because Vancouver Island, of course, it's lumber at that time. That was the main industry was lumber mills up and down the valley. So being a lumber king of Vancouver Island was pretty significant at the time as power, and so that's what how we acquired the estate, built the estate, and I chose, lumber made a lot of sense because of that. That's a prime. British Columbia was founded on the lumber industry, and Vancouver Island specifically with the huge stocks of lumber of the day. So and I went up and down and I studied the pulp, not pulp mills but lumber mills, and how they're managed and that type of thing. So to get some insights uh, into the story, but. I chose the area. It's down by Cobble Hill. It's a wonderful rural area, and I created Fawn Hill. It's just a fictitious town. It's just like Margaret Lawrence's what she would do. She used to devise cities and towns. Gives you a lot of creative license
Mhm.
because it's got to fit the script, and then that gives the freedom. When you write fiction, that gives you a lot of freedom to do that.
Yeah, are those old lumber towns kind of dried up as well? Because I remember your first book with us, Dominion of Mercy, was about Anyox, which was like a mining town, right? And it's basically gone now. So is like the lumber industry, has it left those sort of scars as well?
Well, it's not as much boom and bust as mining. Mining back like Antioch is a copper smelter, but that was just boom and bust based on copper prices. And Vancouver Island, it's sustainable logging, and so it's
Hmm.
still, I'm sure there's the differences are there's more pulp mills back there. It was primarily lumber, so it is still a vital industry on Vancouver Island. BC is founded on resources, boom and bust.
Hmm. I mean, so is Alberta. So it's kind of the Western story is these people who get rich from extracting stuff from the earth and then kind of thinking that they have a bit more social capital than they might.
Yeah.
Um, and your book also touches on the civil rights movement and kind of the ways in which Canada differs from the States with regards to Black people. Do you want to talk about that a bit? Because I was somewhat surprised to hear about the one family's origins and how long they'd been in Vancouver Island and how their sort of approach is going to be different than someone living in the US, for example.
Yeah, that's right. I think in 1858. I mean, it was James Douglas, reforming British Columbia at the time, and he needed citizens. He needed people to come and work in the gold rush. He needed people to come so they could found a province. And he went down to California, and there was 600 immigrants there, and part of them was uh, Sylvia Estee Stark's family, and they moved to Salt Spring Island in the Gulf Islands near Victoria. So they have been in British Columbia a long, long time, and so the characters and the bishops, I wanted to bring that to attention. So I decided to have ancestors brought forward into the estate so that I could actually show how long they lived in BC. Even the Catherine, the Lady Spencer, she would refer to them as those people. Maybe you should be with your own people. But the irony is that they were in British Columbia long long before she was. So I wanted to highlight that. Uh, I like to bring forward things that aren't well known and that you find out in research, that you find out along the way. So that's why I chose to do that.
Yeah, and kind of that paranoia around the Red Scare. That again sort of got me thinking about the War on Terror sort of years, and then the civil rights stuff, obviously, since like Ferguson, the States, and various things that have gone on here in Canada, civil rights, and it's kind of the way Black people are treated is definitely a very important issue that needs to be looked at. But what else? What else do you think you learned during your research that kind of applies to the modern day? Do things just never change? Is it always the same sort of conflicts being repeated, or have people evolved?
Well, it is. It's the same thing, back then, the civil rights movement was huge then. I mean, there was so much disruption in the world at that time. Just race riots, just protests, just the Cold War, the pressure of Russia putting missiles in Cuba. It was a lot of fear. I don't think my parents articulated it how much that affected them. I don't know. But thinking back, when you have the civil rights movement, you have the Cold War, uh, it was a frightening time in its own right. And I don't think we can today. I think we're just aware of so many problems simultaneously at the same time. Back then, it was more linear. We had a TV set and a newspaper, perhaps, and that's how we got our information. But the fears, I think, are similar.
Yeah, you think we would have figured a lot of this stuff out back then, but apparently not. Still working
No,
on,
no.
race relations and yeah, it's that access to information that gets us to understand that there's challenges in every country and all across the world, and climate change especially. You can see how these extractive people in the West, kind of added to that, and it's the global South that pays the price. So.
Yeah.
Um, on that cheery note, I think you've got a little preview of the book for our listeners. Why don't you set that up?
Yeah, well, this is I'm going to start at the beginning. What I did to give some context with the purge is because the purge took place in with my character in 1958. The story takes place 5 years later in 1963. But I wanted to introduce what it was like for Finn Kenny to be interrogated. So at the beginning of the first seven chapters, there's a short piece that is happens in 1958. Then the story continues after that. Just it gives context. So I will start this. It's chapter one. They told me that they had been watching me, an odd thing to say to an employee of the federal government of Canada. I thought perhaps it was part of a performance review. It was not unheard of in Ottawa in 1958, but there were rumors, chilling accounts of similar revelations. I was working on foreign trade, lumber exports to the United States and overseas. I was highly educated with a degree in forest management and civil culture. I was told that two men were waiting to see me in the lobby of our office block. They didn't say who or why, but that it was a serious matter, that I should attend at once, and that there was nothing to fear. Perhaps, I thought, it was one of the Americans that I'd met with over softwood lumber. Meetings had been going on all week. Or perhaps it was the businessman from BC who was looking for new markets, new opportunities. I got on quite well with him, but I was afraid. It was a feeling I had. There was something malicious on the wind that was rushing down the city streets, and it had the face of the trusted. I stood at the back as the early November snow fell heavily over the mourners. They huddled in their woolen coats and hats, solemn with their leaky eyes and reverent eyes. Wore poppies pinned to their chests. They remained stoic, statue-like in the cold, and in good numbers considering the weather. There were immediate family and local people, of course, and there were business types, a few government representatives, others who didn't seem to fit my assumptions. The snow settled over the casket and the shoveled earth and clung to the branches and limbs of the oaks and maples that stood in their perfect cemetery rows. Out on Fallen Hill Road, it fastened to the telephone lines, their sagging bellies dipping dangerously between poles until the snow, loosened by its own weight, fell in long lines to the ground. Nothing moved other than the relentless snow. Even the jaunty crows were absent in their numbers and taunts. There was no sound. Not even Reverend Lafleur could offer an encouraging word against the muted pall of it as he held aloft an umbrella to shelter a selected few like mice under a toadstool. I'd gained certain powers of observation, a keen eye that comes when you lose trust in the world. Some would have said that the snow was beautiful, the lattice work in the trees and shrubbery a blessing for Fawn Hill's favorite son. Theodore Spencer, Teddy to his devout friends, would have quite liked such a day, and I was certain that the gods, if there was such a thing, and he had believed so, had a fitting part in all the loveliness of snow. Not so Catherine, the lady of Spencerwood. Her misery was understandable, of course. She began to sway ever so slightly, a tall woman standing ahead of everyone else where she quite liked to be, up front for the world to take notice. Her two daughters stood just behind her as if in servitude. I considered that perhaps she was merely impatient to get it over with, only wanting to get out of the cold. I couldn't blame her for that. I was soaked to the skin in my knobby tweed, my only real suit of clothes fitting for the occasion. But I would endure it for Ted, what I had called him in order to separate myself from the others. We had become good friends over the years, so much in common between the estate forester and the lumber king of Vancouver Island. And truth be known, I'd felt Lady Spencer's resentment over our relationship. It had always troubled me, put me on edge. I knew that one day soon she would summon me and confirm my musings. She wouldn't tolerate my sentiments, my very personal grief. I was the estate gardener to her, after all, only recently elevated to driver and everything else she thought fitting for her hired help. But I should rephrase my perceptions to be fair to her. I didn't know her that well, only what she showed the world. She was like a lake's stormy surface, and I had no desire to understand her or what went on in her cold depths. It was the most frightening prospect. When the service concluded, there's only a brief show of condolences to the grieving Lady Spencer and the girls, quick smiles and a few comforting words, and always a hand on the shoulder or the arm, as if to help them brace against life's darkest hour. Excuse my cynicism. I don't mean to be uncaring, unsympathetic, but I suppose I found myself on insecure ground for the first time since I came to Spencerwood 5 years before. And besides, there was a reception at the manor. There'd be plenty of time to receive the affections of Fawn Hill and those who came from around the country to show their respects to Teddy. As the crowd dispersed and the men hurried to clear their snow-humped cars, she pointed to my momentary neglect, all the while shaking her head in disappointment. It seemed to me like the rebuke between a mother and her naughty child. And how strange her glower with the snow in her eyes, as if I had orchestrated such an inconvenience out of meanness. Mr. Kenny, she said with a certain emphasis, you hadn't thought to bring an umbrella? So now you'll have me wait in this dreadful snow? How foolish I felt. I was so convinced that I needed to personally escort her that I didn't think to ready the car, broom off the snow, warm it for her daughter. And as the snowflakes melted on her cheeks, I struggled to look at her, into her pitiless green eyes. I was a tall man, and to meet her at the same altitude, as it were, was demoralizing in a way. She made me feel quite small, if that was even possible. So sorry, Lady Spencer, I said. I'll clear it right away. I was waiting for you. I thought, I'm not lame, Mr. Kenny. The car. She pointed indignantly now. Luckily for me, by the time we reached the parking lot, some considerate other had cleared the car of snow. I opened the door for her, the front door on the passenger side. Another error, it seemed. She stood and looked at me, the snow matting her flaxen hair like beaten grass. It seemed an egregious mistake, but more an insult. I had no intention to offend her. I had forgotten. I opened the rear door for her. She got in, and then the daughters behind her. I felt hot in my drenched coat, so miserably damp. My face burned as well, scorched a bright pink, I was sure. I wondered how unlikely it was that I would remain at Spencerwood. I was an arborist. I knew nothing of protocols. Everything in my life had changed the moment Ted's heart gave out. The leaves had been falling over Spencerwood that day. Sudden yellow and crimson releases, perhaps urged by the gusts of autumn. Or was it just their time to let go? The sun was bright and the colors were vivid and breathtaking. I watched from my cabin. He was walking with her along one of the many paths crisscrossing the 20-acre estate, which housed the manor and two cabins as well as a woodlot. As always, I could see and even feel her animation from my window. She stopped often and made great dramatic gesticulations with her arms. She was an accomplished painter and well known. I had to give her that. So perhaps she was painting a scene for him. But that would have been too much, too generous, because it was during one of those theatrical moments that he suddenly faltered and crumpled to the ground like so many leaves. Something she had said? One more demand that he could not meet, perhaps? One more accusation? Oh, it was all so recent, so fresh in my mind. I played it over and over because he was far too young to die in such a way, clutching his chest as his heart had shattered like glass. Lady Spencer's car was a 1963 Cadillac Coupe de Ville. She had to have a new car every year, and yes, it seemed rather extravagant, pointless. I would have overhear him at the post office, in the general store, Van Cole's bakery, the Bramble Cafe, and even outside the Anglican church on those rare occasions when I attended Sunday service. It had become an expected event at Fawn Hill, the talk of the village. What would her car be this year? What color? I was certain bets were made, casts exchanged, and all unbeknownst to her and to Ted, of course. Oh, the carnival that she was, that they made of her behind her back. It was a golden beast of a car, the front seat wide enough for the four of us, and it slid through the slush of Fawn Hill Road now with both my hands gripping the steering wheel like death. I drove slowly through the village with Lady Spencer chortling to her daughters behind me, telling me the virtues of dying in the summer. He did it to spite me, she said. Look, I'm just a mess. What will they think? Oh, mother, Philippa said, don't be so melodramatic. She was the elder of the daughters and mildly reasonable. It's an awful day, Tiffany said in defense of her mother. It would have been better on a sunny day. It really would have. You shouldn't be allowed to have a funeral on such a day. It's not right. You die when you die, Philippa pointed out. Isn't that right, Finn? I wasn't prepared to be part of their conversation. I had no desire to engage them, so I settled for neutral ground. I suppose there's some truth in that. But in the winter, Phil, it's early November, Tiff, Philippa said. Good God. Well, their mother said, your father truly died and it's truly snowing. I hope that's winter enough for you, Philippa. Look, your father was spiteful at times. I want you to know. I can say that much. I looked in the rearview mirror. I wanted to see the looks on their faces, how seemingly intelligent people could have such a conversation after leaving the gray side of a husband, a father. It made it feel more tragic and astonishing, really. They lit their cigarettes and the smoke swirled about their soggy heads. The girls had been away at university. Philippa was studying law, and Tiffany was in her first year of English literature. They would be staying at Spencerwood for the weekend. I wanted to retreat to my cabin. I didn't want to have to listen to them anymore. And then I wondered what Ted would have said if he could have heard them. Of course, he had heard it all before, but never so brazenly. Where was his good influence now? He had a way to bring out the best in people. Even Lady Spencer, with her incessant self-absorption, knew the reach of his benevolence. It brought people to Spencerwood, and yes, to her.
All right. So the book is on sale as of right now on bookstores and online. You can get it from our website. You get an ebook version, whatever you like. Daniel, where can people find you online?
You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram. You can find me on Twitter and my blog, um, Dancing the Muse.
And yeah, I say go get a copy of this. It's great. So this is Matt Bose from New West Press Audio signing off.